Record here. I'll put it here in gallery in a second. So when everybody's engaging in with Tracy, if everyone wants to unmute or use the chat and say, hi, Tracy, welcome Tracy in. Let's get a couple voices if we can. I would like finding the unmute.
Hi, Tracy.
Thank you, Kristen.
Hi, Kristen.
Welcome.
Hi.
Welcome. Okay, you're welcome to use the chat as well, everyone. Just welcoming her in. We have a couple people who are just finding the Zoom room, so we'll get started here in a few minutes. But I wanted to give a warm welcome to Tracy Chalmers, who is, I would say, the End of Life Doula in Canada. That's how I like to speak about you. But, I always like to explain to the community on how I meet the people that I invite into the spirit school space so that you guys can pick their brains, so that you can learn a couple things and develop in a holistic way. So I like to start by, giving the context of me developing my mediumship. And I started developing mediumship in 2013, and I started, serving through the gift of mediumship pretty much right away to the Squamish community, not in exchange for money, but in exchange for feedback. And one thing that I had found was there was a lot of people who came to me with deep states of grief that I had empathy over, but I didn't have like a lived experience of myself. I had not experienced that level of grief at that time. I had lived a pretty lucky experience in my first 30 years of life. And so I was interested in learning more about grief and about how to hold space for grief and how to stay well, and also understand almost like the mechanics. I'm a Virgo, so I like details of grief. And I came across, I was working at the First Nations Health Authority at the time, and there was a lot of conversations going around on, end of life care in hospital systems when it comes to Indigenous death protocols, and how they were working with end of life doulas to try to incorporate some Indigenous worldview into some of the trainings that happen when it comes to holding space at end of life. So I got interested in end of life doula through some of these conversations I had at the First Nations Health Authority that led me to your course program that you run through Douglas College. And I took a whole week off work in December. We're celebrating 5 years, Tracy, as like friends, coming up here in a couple of weeks. And I took your 5-day program, and it was one of the coolest things I've ever taken in my life. I still to this day reflect upon the exercises that you gave us, the conversations that we had, the people I met, the epiphanies that came out of me. And it was one of the most life affirming experiences I have ever had as somebody who really realms in the death realm, like through mediumship and end of life care. And that was one thing that really surprised me. So the way that you taught was a way that like touched my soul, your compassion, your thoughtfulness. And, I know that this is a long time coming, our interview, because you're not someone who loves to be at the center of absolutely everything. But I wanted to share your wisdom and your presence and your knowledge with the spirit school audience. And so for years I've been asking Tracy, I was like, Tracy, come on my podcast, Tracy, come talk to my people. And then she reached out to me. She was like, okay, it's time. Let's do this now. So just some context to how we met, Tracy, but welcome to Spirit School. Do you want to take a minute to introduce yourself, any reflections that you have, and thank you for being here?
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's just such an honor to be here to talk about something as important as how we die and about grief. And yeah, I mean, I just really, so much of what you said just has really inspired me. But I think really what you said there, I think surprises so many people, is that how incredibly life affirming it is to work in the end of life space and the grief space. And a lot of people are surprised to hear that. I've had people say to me over the years, you must not even have tear ducts. Like, how on earth do you spend your life in service to the dying and the grieving? But I find that it makes me feel more alive than ever. It makes me hug my kids harder. It is such a privilege and an honor to walk alongside people on that journey. And it makes everything so much more vivid. You see a sunset or you see something and you realize the people that you had been with that morning probably won't see that again. So I'm really happy to hear that was your experience of the course. And I do think, rewinding a bit to where you started, it's really these Eurocentric worldviews that make dying so much harder than it needs to be. And what we're really asked to do, I believe, is unlearn those worldviews and remember more Indigenous ways of being. And, really, I think a lot of what we do in that course and the courses I offer through End Well is really uncovering our nature, our human nature. And that's really what has sparked me in this work to do all the work I do in the many ways I do it, is that we all have what it takes to companion the dying and the grieving. And we just need to slow down and remember and trust. And a lot of that requires us, to be more intuitive and to have more equanimity, more groundedness, more presence, and just be more heart-centered. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And there's a lot of discomfort we have to navigate as well. And
Mm.
I find that a lot of us will try to avoid uncomfortable situations and avoid things. And you don't get that privilege when you are working with someone who is dying. It's like full presence.
Mhm.
I believe as well, in a lot of the books that I read and that you recommend even through the course, how maybe the industrialization of the medical system has been part of that forgetting on how to walk each other home. Right. And there is a desire and there's definitely a will that I see in people. And it comes through my mediumship readings a lot, how grateful some spirits that transitioned are that they got to stay at home, that their family was able to be by their side. And so I do believe it's just such a beautiful and honoring path. So, in saying that, how did you get started into this path? How long have you been into it? Like, what made you feel like this is how I want to serve and this is what I want to do?
Yeah, it's kind of a tricky question because I feel like I look back on my life and it's almost like there's a whole trail of breadcrumbs that have led me to this place now. I think there was a really pivotal moment early on in my life. I was in grade 5 living in North Vancouver, and my best friend's brother died. He was only in grade 7. And it was just like he was gone. There was no tending to the children. And I don't blame the adults in my life at that time. It was just, I think they were trying to protect me. But the fact that there was no honoring of Andrew and no explanation as to where he went or no tending to my grief, that became a very private experience to me as a child. And that created a lot of fear, a lot of fear. And so fast forward, probably 10 years later, I was volunteering like candy striping at Lionsgate Hospital. And they put me, my job was to just change the water in the flower vases, but they put me on 7 West, which is the palliative care ward. And I was just terrified to enter those rooms. What I ended up finding inside those rooms, but they were just so full of love and so full of connection. And they were the most authentic spaces. And I just the feeling in my body, the peace and the serenity, not always. Sometimes death can be ugly and smelly and loud, but it was so incredibly gentle. And I was like, why did I never know this? And how come more people don't know this? So it was really understanding what death was like, and then really wanting to share that with others. Life got busy. I had children. I was fortunate enough to be a stay-at-home mom. And then when it came time around for me to, have a little bit more time to myself, I really was called back to service. So I've been volunteering at North Shore Hospice now for almost 10 years. And that led me to the doula course. And then that led me to Douglas. That led me to founding End Well and serving as an end of life doula. And that's just blossomed because there's so much need in this area that it's scarcity is not a thing. We need all people in service because they're dying. Like what you said, dying is not a medical event. Dying is a social event with a medical component. So it's calling so many people to come forth and serve their communities. So yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot to unpack on what you just said because I want to go back to the celebration, the ceremony around like a life lived. And it's I was teaching a class on mediumship a couple weeks ago through looking at a world through eulogies, right? Like think about how big a life is and how much a life can touch those who are left behind. And it's bigger than a name and how someone died, which is kind of this list that mediumship has us following. And a life is bigger than that. And you could really look to people's eulogies at their celebration of life to see the impact and the breadth of a life once lived. And, I come from a family that unfortunately, especially my European side, we've never had funerals or celebrations of life or any honoring, any coming of age. Birthdays even aren't really a big deal. And so my line in my generation is really trying to bring back some of these rituals and ceremonies that mark life events that are sacred. This is a sacred path that we are walking. And so, I just wanted to name that because I do come from like a line that doesn't see value in that as much, but it's something that I feel there's no one that's going to pass in my family that does so without ceremony, without ritual, or some sort of acknowledgement, right? Some sort of acknowledgement. I just wanted to bring that out for my own voice. And I really love the servitude in it. One thing I notice in the families that I get to sit with is the role of like the end of life doula is not just there for the dying, but for the family as well. Like how much reprieve it can give to the space holding that family members have to go through as well. Do you notice that?
Oh yeah, it's so much. I mean, you can't separate out the dying and their families. And definitely, the way I like to think of it is if you can imagine concentric circles, like if you were to throw a stone into water and the dying person's in the center. So they are the most important. They can say and do no wrong, right? It's always taking the lead of the dying. But the rings out from the dying represent, the most intimate, the next most intimate, maybe moving out to community, neighbors, acquaintances. And really, yeah, everyone's impacted. As soon as a diagnosis happens, people have anticipatory grief, and the whole grief response starts in advance. And really, as doulas, we're not counselors, we're not social workers. And I love that because our scope of practice literally is holding space. It is allowing people to feel seen and heard. It's feeling with people. And really, when it comes to support, that's what most people are looking for. We're not leading people anywhere. And it's remarkable, even within family systems. I remember when I started this work thinking, oh my gosh, like I'm going to have to take a course in like conflict resolution if I'm going to work with families, because I know there's no such thing as a normal family. My dad used to say normal is just a setting on the dishwasher. And I think that's so true. But when you can hold space for each individual family member to feel seen and heard, it's remarkable how that changes things. That is this what most of us are, everyone's looking for. Did you see me? Did you hear me? And then just normalizing and validating. So I think the simplicity of the scope of practice is so incredibly beautiful. And it does extend out from the dying person and including everyone who's impacted. And quite often as a doula, people are surprised to hear it's almost more often than not, it's friend or family member that contact me and they want to be supported so they can show up for their person, which is best practice. It's better that the friends and family feel empowered to be at the bedside providing care
Yeah.
and not the doula there holding hand for the last breath, so yeah.
I completely agree. And when I started doing this work and I saw how impacted caretaking family members were, I
Mm.
really entered a season where I just wanted to serve people who had to take care of other people at that level because it is all encompassing. And I know, my parents live with me, and they'll be with me until like the end of their days. And I know that I will have to step into that role eventually if, all works out in accordance to divine planning,
Yeah.
if I get so lucky to be able to hold that role. But it is a big one. It is a big one. And we're asked to kind of do that on the side of everything else that we're holding. And so, your advice that you would give to somebody who is supporting someone to stay well and like your advice to yourself, like how do you stay well? I know how you do, but I'm looking forward to you telling people here. And then like, how do you tell families to take care of themselves and how do you tell other end of life doulas to take care of themselves doing this work as well?
Yeah. Well, on a family note, I think, people that are personally affected when their person's on an end of life journey, I really see it as it's a grief journey. And that's something I think we don't talk about enough. So
Yeah.
if we honor that the moment a diagnosis happens, that people are feeling anticipatory grief, and there can be all sorts of other grief layered in there. There can be grief because like an ambiguous loss, maybe your person has dementia, so you're already losing them in other ways. It could be estrangement grief. Maybe you're not super close with the person that's dying and you wish you were, and this estrangement causes another layer of grief. And so it can be this really messy time of grief. And so I think so much of this is like just knowing whatever it is you're feeling is 100% normal and okay. And just if you have anyone to lean out on to validate that, and to, if you have someone in your life that's a compassionate listener, consider yourself very lucky. Someone that'll just come alongside and put a hand on your back or just let you express, because that's what grief asks us to do. It asks us to feel it. So feeling, try to be as aware as you can and feel what you can while you're going through this journey. Also knowing it's okay to take breaks, leaning out on others, expressing your grief, which is the act of mourning. And that can be done verbally or in any other way that expresses what's alive in you. And then that witnessing piece is really what serves us. So having others around us and that leaning out, like dying is really a social event, and we are social creatures, and we live in this weird culture where, we're so individualism is so praised and resiliency is so praised, and this is really not serving us. And I think it is kind of counterculture to lean out on others. And I think we can actually start practicing this now, telling other people what we need. And as far as, self-care for a doula, there's a lot of self-care. I think that this is sort of this part of the practice that we don't get, paid for, which is okay, but it's consistent. Like I would almost say I live my life like a ceremony, because I need so many practices to sustain this work. And I don't think you can do it in um, intimacy and scale. I really don't. Like, I think there's practices before to sort of cleanse yourself and purify yourself so that you can show up as this an empty vessel and practice that equanimity where you're this grounded presence and you can hold that space for other people. That takes a lot of preparation. Like it takes, and it's a personal thing. Those are things you need to discover. Then I think practices around humility, working so close to the veil. There's so much we don't know. And like you said, it's such a groundless time. So how can you be humble and bring yourself back to center in the face of groundlessness? And then there's all the rituals and practices after that I think really invite us to consider how we're going to honor the transformations that happen in us as we companion people and walk them to the gate. How are we going to tend to our grief so that we can stay, like metabolize it, so we can stay like our life force keeps moving and we don't get stuck. And almost like how we can re-enter the world, because there is this time after a death where you go into almost like the underworld of not knowing and coming undone, and then you're sort of put back together, and how can you honor that return and really the gifts that you're given, being so privileged to work so close to mystery. So I think that for me it's before, during, and after. I really look to the elements for balance. I find that that's a really helpful way, and so, earth, fire, water, air, and ether. And I really think it's important to have practices that you can have in an instant, like you can call up like boom if you're feeling unregulated in the moment, so that you can stay present and keep breathing and hold space for discomfort. Because when we're witnessing the suffering of others, it's the hardest thing is that we're called to do. So you are going to get activated. I also think it's great to have practices that are a little bit longer, like a couple hours, and then like full day weekend practices where you can really tend to yourself. You need to be as that self-compassion piece is essential, like giving yourself the same tenderness and care you want to give others. And it's a practice, that sort of, I know we throw around terms like self-love and things like that. And I know it's not easy for everybody, but that gradual turning towards yourself and that gentleness is really needed, because this work, we're going to not do it perfectly because it's not perfect work. And like, how can we be good to ourselves in the face of such human work? I think that's critical as well.
Yeah. Do you have to space out your clientele as well? Like I usually only take, but because I have a lot of other roles, I usually only take 2 to 4 clients a year. That's all I have capacity for. Do you have to do it like that as well?
It's funny, I do not actively advertise my doula services because I'm so involved in the guiding and education piece. So
Yeah.
I really trust whoever finds me, whoever calls me is someone I'm supposed to walk with.
Yeah.
So I haven't yet like said no to people, and it seems to just work out beautifully. I can't explain it. There's flow. There's people that invite me in, and within 2 weeks, they transition. Like maybe they're having a maid provision in 2 weeks. There's other people that are in remission for 3 years. There's everything in between. I find it just, there's a beautiful flow to it, and it's definitely supported by the universe. There's just like, I can't really explain it. There's just so much magic because you're just working maybe magic's not the right word, but there's just so much I can't explain that supports this work with so much grace.
Yeah, I mean, so much of what you say is so applicable to mediumship as well. Like
Yeah.
even going back to, that prep work, it is a lifestyle. And that's what I say
Yeah.
about mediumship. I live the lifestyle of a medium. I live in constant prayer
Yeah.
with spirit, whether it's spirit on the other side, the spirit of the plant or the trees, always tuning into spirit world. And that fills me with the element of light. I see light as like an element quite
Yeah.
visually in my clairvoyance. And so I use the element of light to kind of stay well. At Spirit School, we have a phrase that spirit is your algorithm and spirit is your agent. And I too
Mm.
also do not advertise. I don't even have it mentioned on my website that I do end of life doula work. But again, I've unfortunately lost a lot of friends this year, three, all women my age. And so I get called upon once in a while just from people who know of me in town with this to come sit where I can and be where I can. But it's hard. It's hard work. I've had to reach out to you as well, like at times where I have to
Yeah.
decompress. And, I want to say too, one thing that I find to stay well too is like having a community or having peers to unpack things with, or even just like
Mhm.
voice some things too. And
Yeah.
that's what I've been very fortunate to have access to you when I've encountered some really tricky situations that kind of like rocked me. And so I know that you recently created like a community around, or a collective, I guess you could say, around end of life doula supporting one another as well. Cause I think that that is so, so, so important.
Mhm.
Okay. I appreciate you bringing up all the grief terminology as well.
Mm.
One other one I would bring up that I know has hit both of us very personally is around like disenfranchised grief when it comes to like the loss of a pet. Which I have to say, I do have some friends that do end of life doula work for animals, and
Amazing. I
it's
love it.
really amazing practices. And then I also just want to name too, because a few people that I've helped that I know will be watching this as well. Like sometimes, even when it comes to that anticipatory grief, nothing can prepare you for the real thing as well. And that was one thing that surprised me about my first experience with grief, which happened almost a full year after my training with you. Even all that training I did not prepare me for
Mhm.
the real thing. And I was like, wow, I could have prepared until the cows came home. And so I feel for people too who have that anticipatory grief, but you still have the main event when that loss is experienced.
I think what we can do, I think what you named is so accurate. Like we cannot prepare for grief because grief is so feral. It's so wild and it's different for every loss and it's different for every person. So it's like you cannot practice it, but what you can do is understand the medicine for it.
Yeah.
And so, like, understanding the medicine is witnessing, and it's on two levels. So, taking the time to be with your grief and let it have its feelings. I think so often people feel like it's if you take the lid off or if you start to immerse in your grief, it's going to overcome you, and it won't. It only impacts you and congests you when you don't look at it. So,
Yeah.
really understanding whatever your grief experience is, and it's a full body, full mind, full all encompassing experience that really it's to connect with it and to mourn. We're really lousy at mourning in this culture. So bringing grief from the inside out so that it can be witnessed. So self-witnessing and witnessing with others is the medicine. I think knowing that is really supportive and protective. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you bringing that up. I have so many things in my head right now that are kind of like running through my head. I'm like, okay, I want to get to some of the questions that people have too, because we've been here for almost half an hour, and I want to
Oh,
make sure
wow.
that other people have a chance to come in and say that. But it's just beautiful to hear your perspectives on this and just like grounding into it. It just feels like medicine in itself talking about this. There was one person who wasn't able to be here today, and I want you guys to know that you're welcome to use your raise hand and bring your voice in if you want to come talk to Tracy. It doesn't have to be just me and her at the front. Please use the raise hand function or give me jazz hands, and so I can see you so we can bring you in. We did have a question from somebody said, my question has to do with pain and suffering. Has you seen instances where medication isn't enough for pain? If so, how does your role assist with that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So pain is the number one fear at end of life. It really is. So I think the first thing to do is to normalize that fear. Like, of course, you're afraid of pain because it is the number one fear. And pain isn't just physical pain. So Dame Cicely Saunders, who's the founder of hospice, she's an amazing woman that died in the early 2000s who, oh, she was so busy. She was a social worker, a nurse, a physician, a writer. She came up with the concept of total pain, which acknowledges that pain is physical, spiritual, social, emotional. So this really informs us as end of life caregivers. It's like physical pain is one thing, but the emotional and social aspects of pain are entirely different. And, I have seen so often people that have their physical pain managed, because palliative pain management by the use of, medical interventions is amazing. It can really look after most pain at end of life, physical pain. So as far as physical pain goes, we are doing so well these days. But you can see people that are highly medicated that don't have physical pain, but they have the spiritual, emotional pain.
Yeah.
And that's really, so for that, we need to attend to those things. We need to, help people with that inner work. And I think that's the biggest gap in care is this compassionate um, presence. And really, when we talk about spiritual or inner work at end of life, it really is allowing people to play out this dying role. This is so necessary. And it's like looking back on a life and finding meaning and sharing wisdoms and keepsakes and so really, again, coming back to how simple it is, like we can all do this. We can all show up for people and allow them to express, and this really helps people. So yeah, I would say pain is complicated, and it really does. And in order for people to die comfortably, there has to be that we have to address all the different sources of pain, not just the physical pain.
Yeah. I will say that that is one of the things that shakes me the most at the end is like that the fear, but then also the when you talk to people, admittedly, and I mentioned this on my podcast, I did a podcast episode right after I did your training about the things that I thought about it going in and then the things that I realized afterwards. And one of the things was around like the afterlife. What happens to us in the afterlife? As a medium, I maybe had like this egoic belief that I could bring someone comfort in that way because as an intermediary between worlds, I could pretty confidently say life continues beyond this.
Yeah.
But that is not helpful at the end when you are meeting someone with that real fear, with that real unknown. And trust me when I say, when you sit with somebody in this capacity, you really realize you know nothing.
Yeah.
For sure. And that's not our role. And what I learned from you is like, we're not allowed to do that in this capacity. We're not allowed to impart our beliefs onto other people. And, that it's been beautiful to sit with people with completely different religious and cultural backgrounds and just asking questions like, what do you believe happens like after we go? And giving them space to kind of like unpack that for themselves. And me as a medium, it's always like, what can I produce for you? And this is me actually just leaning back and giving space for other people to be able to talk. And you get some really beautiful exchanges around that, but it can be really sobering. And like you say, you have to kind of bring yourself back because there's a piece of me after every time I experience this that questions, like my faith gets questioned every single time. My faith
Yeah.
in what I believe of the creator and what I believe of the afterlife. And I'm always having to like walk myself back to center, like you say. And that remembrance is really beautiful too. And the questioning is also beautiful, but very sobering. That's the only word I have for it. It's very sobering.
Yeah,
Where
that humility piece. And I think what you're talking about, that you said that also beautifully. I just loved everything you just expressed. And I think like there's this Rachel Naomi Remen writes about the difference between helping, serving, and fixing. And the word doula is actually translated to an ancient word that means servant. And we serve with our whole selves. We serve with our wounds. We serve with what we know, what we don't know. And helping's different. There's an inequality in helping. Fixing's different. That's believing something's broken. Right. So how do we serve? How do we like Wolfelt says, go to the wilderness of the soul with another without thinking we're responsible for finding the way out? Like, how do we companion people? That's what this is about. And yeah, it's such beautiful work. It really does. And it changes all relationships because it's like a way of being. It's not a role.
yeah,
Right? Yeah.
it really, really is. Okay, we're gonna bring Jenna on who had that question before. Hello, Jenna. Come on
Hi,
in.
hi. I'm just gonna come in with my voice.
That's fine.
Thank you for being here, Tracy. This is such a just a powerful role that you, and you too, Danielle, that you both have pursued. And it's just, I just feel like it's like the realest. Um, I'm just curious about that aspect of faith. And, I have a friend dying right now from pancreatic cancer. I met her last year in the Mary Magdalene pilgrimage that I did. And she is someone that definitely embodies faith. Like she embodies it. And that question came from her request about pain. And she's talking about physical pain. Like that was her fear, was being in physical pain. She's dying of pancreatic cancer. And, things are, and so anyway, hearing you talk about like the physical advancements, the medical advancements that we've made in palliative care is like just so reassuring. And from what I've heard, she's doing okay with minimal physical pain. She has like, she's not afraid to die, to go on. And I'm just curious, like, she also is very religious, but I'm just curious, like, what you see in terms of the spectrum of people the spectrum of fear and trust. Can you speak a little bit to that and what you've noticed in terms of like maybe patterns of people's spiritual and or religious lives?
Yeah, I can speak a bit to that. And also just looping back to your friend, it's beautiful that you're here to walk with her. If pain really is, an issue for her, if it's a fear of hers, aside from normalizing and validating that fear, you might also want to engage in conversation with her about where that fear originates, because maybe there's something from her personal history that's connected to, and maybe simply holding space for those stories to come out might be supportive. That just sort of came up as something to offer you as you walk with her.
I wish I could, Tracy, but she's on the other side of the country, and she is actually on her deathbed right now, like literally
Okay.
on the hospital bed in her house with just her husband and daughters. And so
Okay.
it's like this super sacred
Yes.
stillness time.
Okay.
But when you say that though, I think you saying that actually is for me, because there's something there for me.
Okay.
So
And the patterns are, I would say that there's often people are like, how do I get to a place where I'm not afraid of death? And I think that that's sort of an unrealistic expectation. I think because there's so much we don't know, even, in cultures that have a lot more ceremony and ritual and healthy practices around death, there is still fear of death. So I think, keeping our expectations realistic is important, that there likely will be some fear just because of the nature of the mystery of all of this. And it's interesting, you mentioned that your friend is really religious and has a lot of faith. And sometimes that can really be comforting for people, but sometimes that can do just the exact opposite for people that have really lived a life dedicated to a certain faith and specific beliefs. Everything's just about to be tested. This can be really scary for people. And sometimes those people have a lot of death anxiety and a lot of fear arising. I would say the biggest thing, that the thing that I've noticed the most is that the protective thing is if people can have connection, and it can be to one of four areas. There was actually a clinical study done on this, on people that were kind of okay with dying. It was done by Belfort Mount, who's a Canadian palliative care physician. And the study is called Healing Connections. And he said that he did a quantitative study, and he found that, or sorry, qualitative, he found that half the people he interviewed were okay with dying and half weren't. And he found the people that were okay with dying had a connection to one of four areas. And that was either to a deep connection to their self, a deep connection to others, a deep connection to the phenomenal world, which he described as nature or music, or a deep connection to a God or an ideal such as love. So I think that's kind of an expansive approach, thinking it doesn't have to just be a God, or it could be an ideal. It could be music. It could be the forest. It could be a special person, or even an intimate connection to yourself. Because I've companioned some people that don't have people. And I've, people that have never had children and never married. And, this one woman right now I'm working with, she has spent her lifetime dedicated to conserving land, and she's created all these parks. And that connection to nature is really what's giving her meaning in her dying time. So yeah, I would say a connection to one of those four things is really a pattern it's been affirmed in my personal practice.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you, Jenna, for the amazing question and beautiful response. My toxic trait is I have a meme going through my head, of course, as you were talking about that test of faith at the end. And I agree, that's what I've encountered before is like people who have like beliefs that they were raised with, like their parents had, and then maybe not forming their own throughout their life, just working against what they were brought up with. And at the end, it can be like a real conflicting experience, right? It can be a real conflicting experience. And other ways it brings you comfort. My family, and then we'll unmute Julie here, I have to say, especially on my mom's side. I don't know if you've seen this as well, but immediately they know they're not going to get out of hospital. They go like the next day. It's like, I don't know if they can like will themselves into it, but they're just like, I'm out. I'm not going to stay here. And it's just like overnight, it's just like shocking. I'm like, can you will yourself into that? But my family's like unwilling to be in hospital for some reason. Thank you for bringing that in. I'm going to bring in Julie. Hello, Julie. Thank you for coming. Oh, you got to unmute, my friend. Here we go. One sec. And then I'll go to the questions in the chat. I see you.
Okay. I think my question is similar to some of the ones in the chat. I had this question going in and you kind of addressed it, but I think a lot of us just wonder if we might be too empathetic to do this work, and if we might just break down crying with the grieving and not be very helpful. So I'm just wondering if there are ways to kind of like build up your shield to be able to kind of keep it together enough to be helpful for those of us that tend to be, maybe overly emotional or too empathetic, how that plays a role in this work and how we can, learn to keep that under wraps, if that's something that you learn to do or how that can be handled.
That's such a good question. Thank you, Julie. And I mean, I could speak to this all day, I think. I'll start by saying, I think empathy is actually the most, like the best quality to have for this role. But I think we do need to do this role with self-awareness, because we're being asked to come in, and it's a sort of a professional role, right? People are paying us, there's a contract, so I think to really honor that professionalism, and it's that fine line between feeling deeply and acting wisely. I think crying is totally okay. I think we have to remember those concentric rings and honor the way those rings work is you always support in. So if we consider ourselves as people that are supporting the dying and their people, we're like, let's say we're midway out on those concentric rings. So even though we're feeling deeply and we can cry, we're always offering support inwards to people in circles smaller than ourselves. And we need to lean outwards and be supported by people that are further away from the dying person. So I think as long as you keep in mind that placement of where you are in those concentric circles, that can really help to inform you who to support and who to lean out on. And I do think that a big part of this work is creating personal rituals around protection. I know before I work with someone, I do work a lot on purification so I can be like clean and not bring myself. And I'll also create protection around me. For me, I really resonate with this being such heart work, my heart center, and like a pink light and pushing that light through my body and out a little bit as almost like a love barrier where I'll let love in and try to like shine love out. But you also need this constant question of like, what am I carrying and is it mine to carry? And then rituals around purification. I always have a salt bath after. if I'm in the shower, I'll scrub my calves and the bottoms of my feet, really honoring that energy coming through me, that emotional energy that is on our skin. I think we really have to let that go. So you really do, I think, and I bet Danielle sort of has similar practices to that, to be able to hold space for and feel deeply and make sure you're not taking on the heavy emotion of grief. It does require a lot of awareness. Yeah.
And Julie, just to answer too, this comes up a lot in mediumship, where I get a lot of mediumship students saying, is it professional to cry with your client? And I'm here to say you are deeply human, and that very well may happen. What happened to me is I personally was mentored to never express emotions, like very robotic and mechanic, just tune in, go through these steps, bring through these informations. And I actually turned off my emotions to the point where I saw one thing that triggered me, and it was like 6 years of repressed emotions came out at once, and I ended up in therapy, and I've been in therapy ever since, which is like the best thing for me. But the balance that I've had to bring is I've had to actually like set aside time to cry and to process. And I have a bath at least once a week. And the whole intention of my bath is to get fucking messy and just cry. And like, if I held anything in, if anything has been held in, anger, resentment, grief, I give myself like a sacred bath to just like let it out and cry. And I don't need to name what I'm crying about. I'm just expressing. And that's how I've kind of balanced it, because for my first 5 years of mediumship, I refused to cry in front of people, in the name of professionalism. And it didn't help me as a human. And it probably made a lot of people feel like they couldn't cry, right? There is a balance in death doula care, though, where you don't want to, you want to make sure that the other people are not having to hold space for you. Right. Like,
Yeah.
and that's
Yeah.
sometimes what can happen with somebody who's passing and they get visitors. It's like they're made to feel like they have to hold space, and that's not what we want for them in that moment. So again, that self-awareness piece is like really big. And I think that there's a way to cry where it's empathetic and you're sharing in humanity. And then there's a way to cry where it's like, I need support now. And it's just like being really aware of that balance between the two, right? What do you feel, Tracy? Do you make dates to cry? I don't imagine you have a problem crying. Are you Cancer? Where's Cancer in your chart? The spirit schoolers need to know. No. Okay. Thank you, Julie, for coming in. And Juniper is here and she has the next question. So I just wanted to invite her voice in if she wanted to come in to make it interesting. Here you go.
Sure. Thank you. Hey, Tracy. So my question is around, you talked a lot about the compassion, the acts that you perform when you're supporting someone in the death process. What amount of time do you spend with logistics in support of the family or the person dying?
So I'm curious what you mean exactly about like logistics.
My apologies for jumping in. So resources, like funeral arrangements, what to do after.
Yeah.
Do you do any of that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, because as much as this act is, or role is about groundlessness, there are a lot of like really practical things to consider before, during, and after a death. So I have a holistic end of life planning checklist I give people. It's 4 pages. And when I work with people, I invite them to cross off or check off anything they've already done, and then highlight what they want to do, and let me know what they don't want to do. And then sort of prioritize that depending on people's capacity. So that's sort of a starting point to make sure everything's, at least people are aware of what they should kind of think about as far as the logistics go. And then I think of myself as a resource. I think in this role, you have to create a community of practice around you. So getting to know, grief counselors or spiritual advisors or your local hospice or things like that, so that when people invite you in, it's like you are almost bringing in all these services, or at least an awareness of them with you. And then it's really at that point being really open to what's arising in the moment. Because the thing about the end of life journey is things are changing so quickly. Everything changes. Like as disease progresses, like hopes change and fears change and goals change. And so it's this constant conversation and attending to needs that are arising. And then after a death, there's like here in BC, you can go to the government checklist. There's like after death checklist, and there's an enormous amount of like practical tasks that need to be considered after a death. So I would say, to answer your question, it really depends on the people supporting the dying or the dying. Some people come with all their ducks in a row and they're ready to go, and the practical stuff is handled. I literally had a client of mine, a friend of mine / client, who died a year ago, and she had created 2 binders for her wife after her death, called When the Shit Hits the Fan, Part 1 and Part 2. And it was like hooked her up with everything you could imagine. And so she was very easy. She'd done all that. She was an engineer. She was very practical and had all that done. And then there's other people that maybe, like a family I supported earlier this year, where a 50-year-old man went for a colonoscopy and found out he had months to live. So it was a bit of a scrambling time. I think getting these things in order now is really best practice. We all know we're going to die. We just don't know when. And so to just even start creating a binder and thinking about these things and having conversations with your people to express your wishes is just so incredibly important. I had a really serious bike accident this summer. I almost died. I'm lucky to be walking. And as I was lying on the forest floor, not sure if I was going to live or die, I felt really okay with it, because I've been participating in a year-long group called A Year to Live, where we're living this year as if it's our last. And, the idea of preparing practical things, but also preparing relationship things, telling people, I forgive you, please forgive me. I'm grateful for you. I love you. As I was lying there, I felt like my relationships were complete and my planning's done. So, I was really grateful in that moment. So I think it's something we all should do now. And it's an act of kindness to yourself, to others, to medical care teams, I know a lot of people it's so daunting, but you can just begin with conversations, or, start considering the practical things and expressing your wishes.
Yeah. Thank you, Juniper. Great question. And we have Kara, who's going to come on and ask a question. So I'm pinning everyone. I don't know if you can see it. I can see it all organized on the Zoom, but I brought Kara up to the front. How are you doing, Kara?
Good.
Good to see you.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, so are you usually there at time of death, or is it more preparation assistance?
It really depends. So now I would say, I like to think, if people have people, and if I'm doing my job well, and that is empowering the family and friends and those closest to the dying to be present, then maybe I'm not the one there at the last breath, or if I am, I'm kind of more in the background. That is changing a little more nowadays, now that medical assistance in dying is a legal end of life option in Canada, and people can actually plan for their death date. And so now there's often families are inviting me into that moment, or the dying are inviting me into that moment to sort of be there to hold space for the whole family. So that's happening more, I would say, now that medical assistance in dying is becoming more legalized. And it really depends if the person has people. Like I said, this one client right now I'm supporting to create like a web of support around her, because she doesn't have anybody. So it's myself and another doula and some home care nursing and a palliative doctor. And so there's a good chance that I will be there, or my doula partner, at the moment, because she doesn't have, a husband or kids or anyone to be there. So yeah, it really depends on the situation.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, Kara.
Thank you, Kara. We have one in the chat that I'll just read out for now. And if Courtney is here, you're welcome to unmute and bring your voice in. Be curious to know your take on this too, Tracy, but it asks, like, what role might a medium play if they were both a medium and end of life doula? I'll let you answer first.
Yeah, and then I'm sure you can probably answer this,
Okay.
but well, my take on it is, I offer doula training through Douglas College and also through Endwell, my own organization. And there's almost always a medium or two in the class, which I love. And I call it out. I'm like, Okay, who's a medium? I know there's a medium in here. Who's a hairdresser? There's always a hairdresser in here because they hold such beautiful space for people,
do.
right? And there's usually a comedian too. Anyways,
That was
so
Carolyn. That was Carolyn.
oh,
It was Carolyn. She's a
That's
medium and
funny.
a comedian.
That's funny because it's all
Yeah.
about what's real, right? So, yeah, and I will say, as Danielle said at the beginning of this, I'm terrified of public speaking. We used to go to Toastmasters and just tremble. But when I do this work, it's not me. I have my ancestors, my guides around me, and I can talk confidently and I can show up for people because I know it's not just me. I know I'm so supported by the spirit world, my land ancestors, my spiritual ancestors, my family and chosen family ancestors. And I feel that. And I've had people tell me that are mediums, like, oh, well, when you're facilitating your course, there's 4 beings behind you. And it made me just feel like I felt it, but to kind of know it was really amazing. So I feel like, and I do, even when I offer classes, I'll read through the class list and I'll invite in the ancestors of the people that are attending the course to come and help us remember and to guide us because they know we don't, right? And I will say, there's a lot of, I am not a medium, but I'm feeling this role requires us to be intuitive. And I will say, especially in the vigil time, the last 1 to 3 days before someone dies, when they're no longer speaking verbally and they are, I don't even know really how to talk about this, but it's like they've got one foot in this realm and 1 foot in the next. And it's like they're out of their body and in the room more. And I don't usually talk about this, so this is kind of hard for me, but I'll just do my best. That you feel them, like you feel what their needs are, and you communicate. I find I communicate with them differently, but almost even I'm more aware of what's going on, and I can communicate back without words. And then I would say after the death, at least for the first day, 2, maybe 3, there's definitely a felt presence of, like, I'll have full-on conversations with people I have that have just transitioned because they're very present around. And for me, this usually manifests with birds and just this feeling of knowing. So I really appreciate being here because this is part of the work that I don't often get the opportunity to talk about. And yet it's a very important part of the work for me. And I really don't even completely understand it. So I think the role of a medium is huge because mediums are attuned to how to, have those connections. And a big part of my ongoing practice is to deepen my intuition. So simple things like I'll go to the grocery store and try to use my hands to feel what fruits and vegetables I want, and to try to get into this different way of, this intuition and this like feeling, listening with all of my senses is sort of how I see it. But yeah, I think it's a beautiful combination. And I think you can offer a lot of comfort to the dying and their people if you have that interest and ability.
Yeah, I think you said that beautifully, and I would argue you are a medium. Um, in every way, if you look at a medium as being like an intermediary between, heaven and earth, absolutely. I would say you hold that role and you have that communication, because that is what spirit communication is the extra senses and being able to anticipate the need of humanity, but also it's the same with the spirit world. It doesn't feel all that different, right? It's just having the courage to say what you feel inspired to say. I'll take a bit of a different angle with the question where I'm sure that there are some mediums like myself before I took your training where I thought like I could probably give readings to people who are at the end of their day to give them comfort that life continues. And I'll say that that's never felt really appropriate or like or an opportunity to have it done. And it also goes, I think, against the certification. Like, I think that is a role outside of being like an end of life doula or death doula. I do have a student who does that work. She does go to people who are passing and does readings for them. It's really hard work for her. It's really, really hard work for her. And when we look at, what we need to be a clear channel mediumistically, it's that non-attachment. It can be kind of hard to have that non-attachment when you are faced with that reality in front of you. And it just may not always be the most opportune time to conduct a reading. And so that's what I found as I was learning about end of life doula care, like what it actually is, but where I think that mediums can serve really well as end of life doulas. Again, you already brought it up, but that space holding, that ability to anticipate a need of someone, that natural empathy and compassion that we hold for other people who are in front of us. I think that the skills are so comparable in the two spaces. And I think that's why a lot of mediums are drawn to death doula work. But I have had this question come up before. I will say that all the passings I've sat at, there's never been an opportunity. It's never felt right to like conduct a reading. It's also never been asked of me. I think people come to me because they know that I'm not afraid of death, and I'm not afraid to hold space in, some pretty highly charged situations. And so people can rely on me to be a consistent presence for them, like in that space. And I think that's what I do as like a role of a medium. It's really in that space holding. And I agree. I can tell you, if I asked a room of mediums how many of you were hairdressers before, half the room would put their hands up, because like they're just all up in people's like auras all day, all up in the crown chakra. Again, being able to hold space, having to know how to sit with different people of different beliefs, different mindsets, and hold your own energy. Like that's a skill that will serve you for sustainability, right? Because everyone can do it once or twice, but can you do this in a sustainable way that keeps you well doing it? Hairdressers, I mean, they're just the best. Okay, I wanted to bring on Anya, who has a question.
Danielle. And also thank you, Tracy. I think this is so amazing to have this opportunity to ask you these questions live, and thank you for sharing all of your experience with us. So my initial question was around sort of managing empathy, but since that's been answered, I'm going to kind of shift gears. I'm curious if you could let us know, for people who are in the initial stages of exploring this type of work, if you could speak a little bit about like your suggestions about organizations to get connected with. Is it starting out with actually getting the certification? Is it volunteer work? Like, if you could speak a little bit about what you would suggest for people who are just exploring doing this type of work.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's many ways. I think the dying and their people will be your best teachers. So like you said, if you can get involved in an organization, maybe a hospice or a long-term care facility or something in your community where you are able to be with the dying and their people, I think that's a really good thing to consider. This is an unregulated field, but I think it's really important to get training. So there is training all over. I don't know where you live, but I'm sure if you do some research, you can find end of life doula training close to where you are. Yeah, I think there's organizations here in Canada. There's the End of Life Doula Association of Canada, and they have like a supporter membership that's really reasonable, like $60, where you can, begin to create a community of practice and get to know other doulas. There's ongoing communication or education, and there's doula support groups where people share successes and barriers. So I myself am just creating a community. I was hoping to have it up and running by today, but I ran into some technical issues. But I have a education on my offered through Endwell, and I'm going to be kind of creating a community over time with like-minded doulas that appreciate the approach I take, because it's very personal. Some people are more drawn to the ancient side of this work, some people the more modern or practical side. And so so I would say take actionable steps and your way will appear. Like Rumi says, it'll be supported, but just start doing something and your way will appear. It's so supported. Yeah. Thanks for your question, Anya.
And Anya, you're in Vancouver, right? Yeah. Because we went to the same high school, if you can believe it, in Vancouver. She comes to my moon circles. And so Douglas College, I can't recommend it enough. I personally love doing the week-long intensive rather than the split up weekends. There's a couple different formats that were offered. I'm not sure if that's the same, but when Tracy's community is ready, we're happy to promote it here. I posted her website in here in the chat as well, so you can check it out. She also has an Endwell project you can check out as well. I'm not sure which one you want me to share, but Douglas College is, yeah, you go.
Endwell Project isn't mine. I'll just be clear.
Oh,
That's out of the
good.
state. So I'm Endwell North Shore.
Yeah, I got
And
you.
I will say I have it's kind of interesting. I created a doula mentorship offering that is more for, I thought it was more for end of life doulas that wanted that shadowing piece that's not really appropriate to bring, you know, others into a dying room. So I created a mentorship program, and there's someone from Spirit School that took that and is finding that really helpful even without doula training. So it's more case studies and more the energy practices around how to show up for the dying and their people. So it depends. If you want, I think if you want to call yourself an end of life doula, getting the training through, say, Douglas or something is a good idea. And if it's more just a curiosity around, you know, ritual practices and the embodiment of holding space for people, and you're not so attached to the label of end of life doula, or like having that sort of a certificate of completion from a college, then the mentorship course might be of interest as well.
That's beautiful. We'll share links to all this in the replay as well. Just following up on this, and we have 2 more questions. Can you hang out for an extra 15, Tracy?
Oh, I'd love to. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Because we got 2 more questions that came in. Well, 3 if I count this one.
Sure.
But what was it? Can Americans take your training as well?
Not the, I'm not sure. I would call Douglas College to see. I can't answer that. It's interesting. I've never been asked that, but through the Endwell training, yes. But I don't know about the Douglas training. You'd have to call the college. I know that in the US, there's some wonderful training. There's Going with Grace, and there is ANELDA, the International Doula, End of Life Doula Association, that also offers training in the US.
Yeah. So interesting you talk about what you were saying to Anya. So I took my training with you. I think it was like December 5th to 9th. Right. And pandemic lockdown happened like March. So 3 months. So all the hospices closed down. No one was taking volunteers. And I remember our cohort really trying to get engaged. So it's like, we can't hold death cafes, and we can't visual, and we can't. And I was surprised at how many people actually reached out to me online to help just have conversations with. So I was able to talk to quite a few people online during the pandemic as well.
Yeah.
Thank you, Anya, for bringing that in. And please check out her website as well. Sarah Delante, if you're here, you're welcome to unmute and bring in a question, or I'm welcome to speak it as well. And then we have one from Dar.
Hi,
Hi.
I don't look very good today.
You can just bring your voice in, my friend.
Okay.
Yes, yes.
My mother-in-law is a woman that we've had a very difficult relationship, but she's it's time for her to go into hospice care at 91, and she's been struggling. And my husband and his brother are going in charge of her care. So my husband's going to leave here Thursday to help with her because they're afraid that she's going to fall. She's forgetting to take her medicine. And right now we're in the process of getting her into official hospice care. But she's been, my husband's like, she's hallucinating and she's delusional. She's talking to people that are not here, like her sister has passed. And so there's a part of me, I'm empathetic, and double cancer here, so if you hear me cry, that's why, I guess. But I just feel like I should give her a call just to let her know, just to support her, to let her know, I believe you, I know that you're not hallucinating. So I don't know. I guess I just needed to talk about this, Tracy, because I'm just wondering how you feel about this. And is this something that's pretty common when people are passing?
Oh yeah, it's well documented. So there's a beautiful book called Final Gifts by Maggie Callahan and Patricia Kelly. They're 2 British hospice volunteers. It speaks in great detail of what you're talking about, which they define as nearing death awareness. And it's this way that people that are dying They see things, they hear things, it's the symbolic language. People often talk, it's often about deceased loved ones coming to visit. Sometimes it can be about going on a trip or wanting to go home, even if people are home. It could be about collecting parts to a whole. It could be sort of mix up in timelines, like I'm in Tuesday, but you're in Wednesday. Sometimes it's about going up or down. And it's very different than hallucinations, because hallucinations are out of context and they're upsetting for people. But this nearing death awareness actually helps people die. And it happens all over the world, all different religions, all different cultures. And it's so important that those close to the dying connect and not correct with these visions. So like if someone's home and they say they want to go home, as opposed to like, no, you're already home, saying something like, it's okay to go home. If people are talking about seeing a deceased sister, oh, that's so wonderful she could be here. I'm glad that she's here to join you. Or how does that make you feel? So I think there's also a beautiful TED Talk if you don't feel like reading a book. It's by Martha Atkins, and it's called More to Dying Than Meets the Eye. And it's about 12 minutes long. But she talks about this and the importance of family members being on board and how it is so real. I've seen it so many times. And people reaching up, 90-year-old women reaching up and asking or saying mom, and people holding babies that family members didn't even know they had that died in infancy. And I mean, again, it speaks to the wonder of working so close to the gate. And we really must be open to this, and we really must support these deathbed visions.
Yeah. I hope that's helpful for you,
Yeah.
Sarah. And I just want to say, like, one thing I've seen as a pattern somebody says is, I can't tell what's real or not.
Mhm.
I've heard that quite a bit. Like, I was trying to think of that movie, Leonardo DiCaprio. Is it called Son of the Spoonflowers? I am so bad at like remembering names of things, guys, but there's a Leonardo DiCaprio movie about indigenous community down in the States. And there's a scene where this woman passes and she's like laying in bed and they're like rattling around her, and she sees her mom and she sees her elder, and in the scene she just gets up and follows them. And it was like this beautiful representation of like the transition and how seamless it was. And it just like, as you were talking about that, it just like covered me in shivers, how beautiful the representation was of that passing and how I envision it is. It's like I see them there and she just like follows them into the next existence, the next life. And it was so seamless. It's just I have the scene so clearly in my head. So thank you, Sarah. And I'm sending you a lot of love to you and your husband as well during this time. Please let us know if you need any support. Let us know. Sarah's been part of this community for a long time. So Dar has a question, and then there's one more on Maid I'll probably just ask for you. But Dar, if you want to come and unmute.
Hi, this is a little sideways. I hope it's okay. So, my question was kind of a little bit bordering on what Sarah started, but is there any advice for those of us that are, like we are here with very, sensitive and just lots of feeling, and with people that won't allow you to hold space, like, during that time. And then my mother-in-law was like this, and she has since passed, but she wasn't even on my mind. I was thinking about my mom. And then when Sarah came on, I was like, oh, interesting, because my mother-in-law was the same way. And it was really difficult. And I don't know if that's totally appropriate for here or not, but
I think it really is appropriate. And I think you're bringing a real quality into this conversation. And thank you for your vulnerability. And I'm feeling with you, not just your mom, but your mother-in-law. So I think for this, we're asked to recognize that people die the way they've lived. Right. And I don't mean that in a nihilistic way, like people can experience great healing before they die, but typically. And so I think that really has to inform our expectations. And, there's this concept of like a good death. And I think that can be almost harmful because we feel like if we can't give that to people, we've done something wrong. So I love the idea of a fitting death. So chances are your mother-in-law, your mother are going to die a fitting death according to how they've lived. I also think energetically, I know like on a personal level, I will really intentionally reflect on the things that I cannot change about people that I love dearly. For example, my mother, like there's things I wish were different in her that I can't do anything about. So I intentionally, energetically cut those cords of just the things I can't change. And I think the end of life doula work is you have to almost take a change management approach to a death. Like, what are the things we can change, and what are the things we can't change, and accept those things, and really focus on what you can change, and always coming heart forward, always being tender, and always giving people the space to open up. Because what happens too at end of life is all the bullshit falls away. And oftentimes people who maybe have, for whatever reason, maybe, not been the easiest to be around, there's so often a softening and a reckoning because the ego starts to dissolve, right? That sort of dark night of the soul. And so, who knows, maybe things will shift and change, maybe they won't. But I think it's really important that we have realistic expectations when we companion the dying. Yeah, I hope that's helpful.
Yeah. Oh, that was perfect. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dar. Any love. I'll say we got one comment here that I wasn't even aware of. So this again is just how spirit works. But Lindsay says, thanks for hosting this on National Grief and Bereavement Day,
Oh,
which I had
perfect.
no awareness of. And I was
Either.
like, we just kind of like landed on this date last month. So I love that for us. And we just had one more question from Steph. I don't see her here. If you're here and want to unmute, you're welcome to, or I'm happy to read your question. This will be our last question. Okay, I'll read it just in case we had a couple of people hop off at the hour. So she just said, I'm curious if Tracy noticed I'm curious if Tracy notices any energetic difference or any difference in her work with maid deaths versus non-maid deaths. So maid is medical assistance in dying.
Yeah. Wow. This is kind of loaded in a way because like I really think it's awesome that people have end of life. They have choices, right? And this is what this is. It's a legal end of life option. I will say maid deaths, like I guess I'm dodging the question here because when you're there, they're very peaceful, right? People, it's just like falling asleep. And this is really beautiful for usually the friends and family. People are most maid deaths happen in the home. So most maid deaths are, in the comfort of the home, the right people around. You can orchestrate these deaths. People can wear what they want to wear. A client of mine this year even had a happy death day cake that her daughters and granddaughters brought her on her maid day. So there's a lot of, I think that really supports the family and friends that are left behind to feel this. And it's just like going to sleep, right? What happens when people die is there's this withdrawal of the elements. So first goes the earth element, then the water element, then fire, then air, ending the last breath. In maid deaths, this happens really quickly. Like in sudden deaths, it happens in the same order, but it'll happen in really quick succession. Yeah. And energetically, all I can say is it's hard for me to comment on this. I had one really intense situation with someone who died by maid afterwards. I kissed her on the forehead and got energetically entangled with her for a while. So I don't know if that's even relevant to maid or maybe just me not knowing that I shouldn't have kissed her there at that time. But yeah, I don't know. I'm having a hard time answering this because I'm feeling some personal bias come in. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that. And I'm sorry, it's not really an answer. And but I wonder about it. I wonder about it a lot because people are accessing it more. And personally, I can speak from personal experience. I'm so curious about my dying time. I'm so curious what I'm going to learn about myself and what's going to be revealed as my ego loses its hold. And, I think in my belief, my soul is being born. And so because that's really important for me, I have a hard time understanding, like I wouldn't want to access MAID. I don't think. I can't say that because maybe I will if I'm in a situation where my pain becomes unmanageable. So I'll watch myself there. But the way I'm imagining my death now is a natural unfolding. I gave birth to 3 children and did it, in a way that was right for me, which was feeling my way, trusting my body, allowing it to do what it's meant to do. Again, no judgment on people that use interventions in birthing. Sometimes they're necessary. But my hope is my dying will be similar, and it may not be. So I don't know. I come at death with such a curiosity of being with pain and allowing that dissolution of the elements to happen naturally, that I wonder if when they're sped up like that, if what happens to people, I don't know.
Yeah. It's a tricky question. And I'm going to come in with a very different experience, a very
Okay.
different mindset, and neither are right or wrong. It's just
Mhm.
conversations with 2 death doulas here, right? So I will say I've had some of the hardest conversations I've had with people at the end of life is around MAID.
Mhm.
Um, I've had to have I've had to have conversations with people who have religious beliefs that it's suicide. And we've had this conversation, you and me, privately, around being just kind of like blindsided at the moment with a question like that. If it's not suicide, then what is it? And
Mhm.
not having an answer other than it's compassion. It's like
Yeah.
a compassionate way to go. Now, when we were in death doula training with you, though this was years ago and the stats may have changed since then because MAID is much more accessible now than it was even 5 years ago when I did training. But you brought in some stat that said about, I remember it was like 70 to 80% of people who get approved MAID don't end up using it. It's
Yeah.
just something that they have that gives them kind of like empowerment to like face the end on their own terms. And it's almost like a last, like I have control over this, even just for a moment, even though you don't have control. And a lot of people are able to face it more naturally when they have that in their back pocket as an option, right? I want to go to my birth, which this is before I became a medium, or was spiritual in any way, right? I just basically worked with race cars and like working First Nations healthcare. And my birth plan was like, you guys got to figure out what would kill me, scale it back a little bit. And like, if I don't even have to be awake, I don't even want to be awake. You know what I mean? And my first daughter, she was 2 weeks late, and I'm like, we're going in today.
Yeah.
Because I was trying to create a birth experience that I wanted the birth lady, I guess it's like birth doula. I wanted her there, a specific one. So I was like, we're going in today because after 10 days, it was my choice. And I often wondered what my recovery would have been like, what my birthing experience would have been like if I just exercised a little bit of patience. So I am someone who will easily say right now, like if MAID's accessible, she's taking it. That's me because I try to control a lot of things in my life.
Mhm.
And that's like my mindset around it. But I always think about what you told us around it just empowers some people to face it in their own way, whether it be through MAID or whether it be through
Mhm.
the other way. As a medium, I will say I've brought through like murders, and they are in the same place, in the same space, at the same, the energy is like my nana and my nanny. And I've brought through people who have died from like COVID. I've brought through people who have died through medical assistance and dying. And as far as I can tell from the spirit side, I haven't felt any difference.
Mhm.
But also spirit doesn't like to focus too much on their passing per se, but they will bring up a medical assistance and dying experience. And so again, there's no right or wrong answer in society and civilization. We are at one of these divine free will turning points in life around, where's this going to take us, and who's going to hold legislation over it, and where does the people empowerment come in? Like we're kind of in this really fluid and flexible state, I feel, with it right now that's still kind of unfolding. So just a different perspective on it, but again, there's no right or wrong answer around any of
Oh,
it.
and I love that you're inviting in the compassion because that's what we're asked to do. And I think it speaks so a lot about living in a death phobic culture and people being terrified of dying. And of course, people want to, find a way out that, isn't what we're so inundated with images of death and ideas of death being horrific and painful and awful. And we're not acquainted with gentle, normal dying, and no wonder people choose this. And of course, people want control at a time in their lives when they have so little. So I think it's a big picture thing. And yes, I love the compassion. Thank you, Danielle, for bringing it through that lens.
No worries. I appreciate this. So we're a little bit over. Jenna did have a hand raised if you wanted to bring in a comment or anything, Jenna.
Okay, yeah, you kind of just touched on it in terms of like our culture and the fear, death phobia and all that. But I was just thinking, or I just wanted to know, in your experience, do you find that most people who choose the MAID path are people who have been diagnosed with like really debilitating diseases like ALS?
There's a variety. I mean, I've supported a woman, like I've supported people that have had, debilitating diseases for sure. Fibromyalgia, dementia, that's a tricky one because you need to, people need to be able to give consent or at least sign a waiver of final, releasing final consent. So that one can be a bit tricky. But yeah, I mean, that's the criteria for MAID is people must have an intolerable condition in order to even be accepted. So I don't know if that answers your question.
In the States, because I think Jenna's in the States,
Yeah.
a lot of spirit schoolers are in the States. And I just want to say it's a little bit different. It's state by state down there. Canada, it's like across Canada as far as I can understand. But in the States, it's really kind of like a state by state. I don't know how many states have medical assistance in dying. I think you guys even call it something a little bit different. You'll have to. But one thing I will say is when I sat with people online who were kind of like facing the end of the days, there was a lot of like anger around not having it accessible. There are certain situations where people would like to have it as a choice and as an option. And it's just not. Again, this is where we're at, that kind of like we're in the crevice of what was and what will be, right? And so we're really in this time of divine free will. I always like to, when I give prayers, think about like the great minds who are advancing our medical, like, the great minds who are on, a solution for cancer. Like, thank you, Spirit, for inspiring these incredible minds. Thank you for bringing compassion to the legislatures, to the people who are holding like the pen. And when I think about, as little as I have influence over that space, that's all I can do. And that's really powerful in itself as well. And I just say it as a prayer, I'm like, we're really in this divine free will time. So if we can inspire and bring compassion and light into the hearts of the people who make these decisions, then maybe that will advance us further along in it. But in the States, you'll have to look at your state and see where the laws are with that as well. And I know in Canada, we have an opposite problem, guys, where last year they basically lumped in mental health into being able to access MAID. And that brings up a whole world of problems because let's face it, our governments are just starting to bring mental health into their vocabulary, right? Like into their vocabulary. So there's like these pendulum swings that are happening and we'll just find ourselves in center. So as centered as we can be in our philosophies around this and not have any hard and fast truths or think that we know like the right answers, I think that will kind of influence the space as much as we can. I don't know if that makes any sense, but hopefully it did.
Oh, it did.
Yes. Any last words, Tracy, from you? Thank you for spending 90 minutes with us at Spirit School. But, I think about, my final reflections are, and then I'll hand it over to you to close us off. But, I think about this exercise that was the most life affirming thing that you brought us, where you had us like write down like 16 things that meant everything to us. And one at a time, you took it away from us. And then there was times where we had to choose, we had to let go of one thing. And it made me realize, like at the end of our days, we really just have our love and our experiences, right? We don't have a wallet. We don't have a set of keys. We don't have a home or a car. It's like we have our memories, we have our experiences, we have the love that we shared with people. And that to me was what made me pursue mediumship full time. Because I was like, well, then I want to live a life where I can be more with family and do something that I'm passionate about. And that's the effect that it had on me. Just realizing like, wow, at the end of days, none of this matters. It really is like this experience. And so I've lived life so differently since taking that training. And I've wasted not even a moment of love and connection that I have, because I know that that's what's going to sustain me for the rest of my life. And I leave it up to you.
Well, I just piggyback on that. That's what people think about in their dying time is like, was I loved enough and did I love enough? Like it always comes back to love. And and knowing that that's the end game, then it's really beautiful to let that inform how you are. It's really so simple. And the other thing I'd say is, like, we all can do this. This is the part that really, my work is I love small scale change, like just letting people know, yes, this is going to be hard, but you can show up and you can walk alongside and you already have what it takes. It's just remembering like we're already enough. And how can we just offer this simple, compassionate presence and just listen and allow people to play out this dying time and so that they know they're not alone. Yeah, it's such beautiful work, and it's such a beautiful way to practice, because all your relationships in life will be changed by meeting things with your heart more, and honoring what the end game is. It's always about love. It's that simple. It sounds cheesy, but it's just so true, and I see it time and time again. It's always love in the end.
Yeah. Beautiful. Beautiful. Well, thank you everyone for coming. If you want to unmute and just bring your voice and say thank you, Tracy, that would be
So
so
much. Thank you,
Thank
Tracy.
you, Tracy.
Thank you, Tracy.
That was
Thank you.
beautiful.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Danielle.
Thanks, Tracy.
Thank you.
amazing. So
Oh,
thank you everyone for your generosity, just in your presence and your comments and your questions. It just means for us as teachers, it just is fulfilling for us. This is what fulfills us as teachers. So I just want to say thank you. I'll have the replay up later today. I'll have Tracy's Instagram, her website linked if you're looking to get some training from her, whether through the certification or through her upcoming space and mentorship that she'll have going on. We'll be sure to share all the Tracy magic here at Spirit School. So thank you, Tracy, for coming.
thank you so much for having me. It was such a delight. Yeah, it was great being here. I loved it. Thank you.
Awesome. We'll see you in Spirit School, everyone. Bye. I'll see you on Instagram, Tracy.
Okay, yeah. Sounds good. Bye.
Bye.